Welcome to Just Energy Radio with your host, naturopath and medical intuitive, Dr. Rita Louise. We have learned from Einstein's theory that matter and energy are one. Physicists believe that all systems in nature have their own particular way of vibrating. From the swinging of a pendulum to the waves of the ocean to the light that brightens the sky each day, each of these oscillates at its own unique rate. The same holds true for every thought, feeling, event, or word we speak. Each has its own frequency or rate of vibration. What many of us don't realize is when we take everything in our universe down to its simplest form, it is all just energy. Join Dr. Rita Louise on a journey through time and space where past, present, and future collide. Today, what you believe may be called into question. What we want to know is, who made up the rules? Be brave and step outside the box. We are about to turn our world upside down and venture into the unknown. Hold on. We are departing our own beliefs and entering alternative realms. Enjoy the possibilities.
Hello and welcome to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for tuning into the show tonight. Yet another amazing episode we're going to have. We have Douglas Dietrich coming back on the show to talk about World War II didn't end the way you think. It's like, but I thought I knew how it ended. So I guess I'm going to get a history lesson tonight. Just Energy Radio is brought to you by soulhealer.com, where you can find out about all the products and services I offer, including medical intuition evaluations, energy healing, and psychic readings. So if you need some guidance or advice, have a health situation, a problem at work, or a problem in your relationship, give me a call, send me an email, and we can set up a time for a private consultation. It's also brought to you by the Institute of Applied Energetics, where you can jumpstart your intuition today by downloading their free 50-page guide. That's www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com. And if you haven't gotten your copy of Icon, Deconstructing the Archetypes of the Ancients, they're still available. You can get a DVD copy, you can get a digital download, or you can do the little rental thing, and that's only $1.99, written and produced by you-know-who, me. So that's priceless right there. Anyway, let me tell you a little bit about Douglas Dietrich and get him on the air. Douglas Dietrich was a DoD research librarian for almost a decade, responsible for incinerating highly classified materials on critical historical topics such as Pearl Harbor, Roswell, Vietnam, and the different ethnic holocausts, as well as documents exposing the reality behind vampires, zombies, Soviet psychic warfare, and other occult phenomena. He has presented at conferences such as ConspiracyCon 2011 and UFO X-Fest, as well, and has been on radio shows such as Coast to Coast with George Norrie, and of course here on Just Energy Radio. So please welcome to the show, Douglas Dietrich. Hey, Douglas, how are you?
I'm much the better for speaking with you, Dr. Rita. Very honored to be back, and certainly glad to be talking about subjects that are important to all of us. Even today, in historical context, I want people to recognize that what we're going to talk about is not empty history or some kind of specious semantics involving a redefinition of how that history turned out, but something that impacts us every day today.
Well, Douglas, it seems like in the last, I'm going to say 20 years, but maybe not even that far, there has been this mass movement of really redefining our history, our ancient history, with the whole ancient alien thing and how old are the pyramids. And I find it's interesting that some of the material you bring forward are myths, truths that have been filtered into our contemporary history that are clouding our knowledge of ourselves today.
Yes, very much so. And the problem is that people are much more comfortable with what is in the ancient past, because what is in the ancient past deals with many ethno-nationalist identities such as Sumerians, Babylonians. For the most part, these are people who no one is really going to relate to in the postmodern world. And as a result, kind of redefining our understanding of them is not quite so painful. What really is painful to a lot of people is having paradigms paradigms, axioms, delusions, and illusions that have been fed and indoctrinated into them since childhood, totally shattered open. And with your permission, I'd like to get into some of that right now. Some impressions that people have of who's running the world, who's not. I'll leave it to you to start off with some questions that take us in that direction. But definitely, I want people to understand, better get ready, because everything you thought was true for the most part is going to be proven entirely wrong.
Well, I think the first place I would like to start, because this is something that I find interesting and fascinating, is the concept of, well, I'm going to back up. Individuals like Jim Marrs talk about that the Third Reich never died and that they are this viable force underlying the government and the New World Order and secret societies and stuff like that. In your research, what happened to the Nazis after the war?
Well, let's get into this in such a way that people understand the reality of what we're talking about. The first thing that I'd like to say is that Jim Marrs is someone that I've spoken to on air, on Coast to Coast, as a caller myself. I called in, I spoke to Jim Marrs for a few minutes on air, and certainly he's one of the nicest men you'll ever meet. The problem with Jim Marrs, and there is a problem with what he's doing, is not in the individual himself. He's doing the best that he can do as an investigative journalist. Now, like any other investigative researchers, this includes Joseph Farrell, many other men who are doing their best to dig up what they can out of documents that are available through academia or through the military to the media. They're trying to piece together a puzzle. And the problem is all of the fragments that they get are very jagged, very shattered, and they piece together a pastiche of grease paint that reeks. It really has nothing to do with reality, and they're misdirecting everyone. What people get the impression of through individuals like Jim Marrs is of a NOG, or a Nazi occupation government. Now, this is utterly ridiculous. It's as absurd and as ultimately self-defeating and degrading to all humanity as the concept of a ZOG, or a Zionist occupation government that's pushed by neo-Nazi skinheads. It's ridiculous for all of the reasons that should be obvious. If the National Socialistisch ran America and the Western world, the trains would run on time. You would not have an ethnically interbreeding population. The highest rate of birth in the world is amongst people like myself, mixed race births that are happening increasingly in America's inner cities on a daily basis. Beyond that, you have an exceptionally small military, despite the fact that you have an enormous military budget. This is all due to enormous corruption and incompetence. Now, the National Socialistisch were famous for full, total wartime mobilization, making the most of all the resources that they had in the most ruthlessly efficient manner. You certainly don't have that in the United States. You have the entire Department of Defense of 100,000 bureaucrats, together with your reserves, with your Marine Corps, your Coast Guard, all the various branches of military service, including the National Guard, and you come up with less than 1% of the population. Now, with that small amount of people in the military, you really are stretched thin all over the world, and all the money goes into the pockets of a lot of people's slush funds. These are corrupt generals, various politicians, defense contractors. Now, none of this would have existed in the Reich, and beyond that, of course, you have a reality of course, a large Jewish immigrant population that came over in the Second World War for understandable reasons that are known historically, popularly as the Holocaust. Now, many of these people came here and resettled to escape genocide. So we do have a large Jewish presence, undeniably, in Hollywood. We do have a large Jewish presence, undeniably, in finances. Do you think a Nazi government would allow that? It's absolutely ridiculous.
And I'm just going to throw in, my understanding, and this is just my understanding, was that it wasn't necessarily running the United States, but was kind of being more, like more New World Order. But I see what you're saying. It's like all the things that they were against are happening. So
Yes,
Yeah.
and to put this in some perspective, this is not to say that the Third Reich never died is exactly what I said in the last interview that we had. That's quite true, but to put it into some perspective, that's not what Jim Marrs says. Jim Marrs uses the term Fourth Reich. Many people use that term Fourth Reich, and it is a misnomer. It's a misapplication. It doesn't make any sense. There is no officially recognized Fourth Reich. No one is out there waving any flags that are representative of a Fourth Reich. So what exactly did I mean when I said the Third Reich never died, as opposed to what Jim Marrs is saying, which is basically there's some kind of obscure cabal of financial influences that are bringing forth a new world order. Absolutely absurd in the face of it, because we're a new world order to be National Socialistisch influenced or Nazi influenced, to use the popular vernacular. We would have a very fascistic new world order, as opposed to what we have, which is a lot of laissez-faire capitalism and a lot of incompetent corruption on the part of international bureaucracies like the United Nations. So what we have is basically a system that's going down the tubes. I'm not saying that the National Socialist system is idyllic or utopian, but the one thing that could be stated for it would be a ruthless efficiency, no matter how murderous it was, certainly at the time during proactive prosecution of hostilities. Now, in terms of where we are at today, the National Socialist government in exile is very similar to the government which I was born in, which again very few people know about. And briefly, I was born on the island of Taiwan, on which the reconstituted Nationalist Republic of China exists. Now, the war between Japan and China lasted for quite some time, but it ended around 1945, at which point the nationalist government of China had to put all of its resources into fighting the communist insurgency. Now, the Americans supported the communist insurgency. This was actually a, shall we say, a policy that had started, as unofficial as it was, during the Roosevelt administration. And at that time, you had Evans Fortis Carlson, who essentially started the Second World War between Japan and China, and America, between Japan and America within the Chinese theater on the mainland of Asia. My father was there in country at the time. My father was 16 years old. He joined the U.S. Navy to escape from Rochester, New York, which was a Kodak company town, run like a concentration camp. He basically joined the Navy to get as far away as possible, and they gave him that wish. They fulfilled it. He was sent to China. While he was in theater, China Command, he was, along with the British, basically cooperating with the Japanese to try and put down piracy on the rivers and fight the warlords that were endemic throughout China at the time. Now, all of that changed when General Claire Chennault, General Fortis, and General Fortis Evans Carlson came onto the scene. Now, Evans Fortis Carlson was a Marine Corps general. He was an adamant communist. In any other administration, he would have been court-martialed for treason. But in the Roosevelt administration, he was given promotion to the rank of field general, and he had an entire staff. This meant accountants, logistical support, quartermasters. He had thousands of men underneath him, and they basically broke up the peace talks between nationalist China and Japan in the capital of China at that time, Nanjing. And when they did so by attacking dressed as Chinese guerrillas in ink-blackened Chinese coolie uniforms, very similar to the later-day Viet Minh. And the Japanese naturally assumed this was a Chinese ambush. The rape of Nanjing began, and hundreds of thousands of people died. It was only later the Japanese identified their assailants as Caucasians, and there were only two Caucasian powers in central China at the time, the British and the Americans. That's when the Japanese retaliated by bombing the United States ship Panay and His Majesty's ship Lady Bird. And this was on December 12th through the 13th of 1937. At that point in history, the United States and Japan went to war. And at that point, everyone back in the United States knew it. Every time my dad went home on leave, everybody would ask him, how's the war going with the Japs? Now, this was years before Pearl Harbor, and everybody knew we were at war with Japan. And suddenly, when Pearl Harbor happens, everyone's offended and everyone's surprised. It would be as ridiculous as the North Vietnamese conducting an attack in mainland United States and everybody being shocked or surprised that they did so simply because we were killing tens of thousands of Vietnamese overseas. So this is the kind of nonsense that we're dealing with in terms of American irrationality and the lack of temporal context or chronological index. But beyond that, we had a situation in which the Chinese nationalists, which formed the government that relocated to Taiwan, in which I was born, found themselves at war with these communists that Roosevelt and Evans Fortis Carlson supported, as well as Claire Chennault. And what happened was they wound up killing more of each other in this massive communist nationalist war, the Chinese did, than Chinese were killed by Japan. And the Japanese killed 100 million Chinese throughout the Second World War. And it went well beyond that within the Civil War, which is always more vicious than an international war in China. So at that time, the nationalist Chinese were forced to switch sides, and in 1945 they became a member of the Anti-Comintern, or the Anti-Communist Internationale, the Axis. So when they relocated onto Taiwan, then they brought a lot of the Axis governments with them. So what happened was, just as in World War II, when the Axis powers occupied Denmark, they occupied France, they occupied the Philippines, they occupied many other nations in the world, many exile governments were formed in the United States. Now, I know all about this because I dealt with the documents. The United Nations was formed on January 1st of 1942, exactly 3 weeks and 3 days after the Pearl Harbor surgical strike. And when it was formed as a military organization per Title 42 of the United Nations Charter, as an organization of war. In lieu of a constitution, they have a charter as an international organization. It was formed on the Presidio military base of San Francisco. That was its Pentagon. And its job from there was to coordinate all of the resistance armies behind Axis-occupied lines to fight the Axis powers, the resistance armies of Denmark, the Philippines, anywhere in the world. They were all coordinated, 100 governments, through the Presidio military base of San Francisco. The peace branch of that organization, the United Nations, was opened in 1945 in New York City. But the war branch is where the peace treaty between Japan and the United States was ultimately signed in 1951. The Japanese-American peace treaty, again, September 28, 1951, signed on-site the Presidio military base. This is where I worked as a Department of Defense librarian for decades, nigh a decade, and certainly went there a decade beforehand as a child, reading everything I could in the library that was open to the public without security clearances, who was a member of the U.S. military family system. We are called military dependents. Now, in terms of everything I was exposed to, later on classified as a genuine military librarian, I can tell you the fact that we were at war well before Pearl Harbor took place, both in Asia and, of course, unofficially in Europe. And then when the war came to an end, it was at a far different time than most people realize, and the overwhelming majority of these documents were destroyed. I destroyed quite a few of them as a DoD librarian under orders. I incinerated them so they would never go to the media, so they would never go to academia. So everything the professors and, of course...
Did you work, or did you just sit around reading all of this stuff and making copies? No.
I collated and made enormous amounts of notes, and I also had a very good memory, and I committed many of the details to memory, much of which I leaked, by the way, so there is much of this that is out there. If people look up the Japanese-American Peace Treaty, they will find it on the Internet, and they will find that the peace treaty was signed on September 28th of 1951, did not go into effect until August 28th of 1952. So until 1952, the United States and the Empire of Japan were legally at war. That war ended in Japan's favor. Japan won that war. We can go into that later in the show as we move in, but in terms of America's war with the Third Reich, it never ended. It's very similar to what's going on in North Korea and what's going on in island China. That happened in the Korean Peninsula was that North Korea and South Korea are still legally at war. The United States was was part of a United Nations action on the Korean Peninsula. They entered into a ceasefire. That ceasefire is held today under talks and discussions at Panmunjom in, for all intents and purposes, perpetuity. So we're constantly meeting there for a still ongoing war that legally has both nation states, North and South Korea, mobilized. The United Nations is still involved. Any American troops' bodies who are found dead from the Korean Peninsular conflict lasting from 1951 to 1953, their bodies are shipped home in coffins which are draped in the United Nations flag. Their coffins are not draped under the United States flag. They're draped under the United Nations flag. They're counted as United Nations casualties. So that's why you never hear of anyone dying in Korea. Now, we get back to the state of a war between China. It's still in a state of civil war. Communist China declares Taiwan its renegade province. Taiwan declares itself the legitimate government of mainland China. They are still legally in a state of war. Now, my nation I was born in, the nationalist Chinese government was one of the founding members of the United Nations. We were on the Security Council along with the Soviet Union, the United States, Britain, France, and Russia. I mean, the Soviet Union, Britain, France, the United States. I'm trying to remember. It was just basically five in the original Security Council, and nationalist China was one of them. We were later on evicted because we sided with Japan and Germany as part of the Axis. As a result, communist China was moved in. That's why Taiwan, the nationalist republic on that island, is not recognized by the United Nations today. So as a result, you have this entire situation that has turned on its head. Nobody remembers it in the United States. Nobody knows why, and nobody asks. Well, just as all the exile governments from Europe and Asia came to the United States and opened up shop here for the most part during World War II, where did all the Axis governments go? Where did the embassies for the Romanian government in exile under the fascist Ivan Guard of Hiroshima go? Where did the Italian fascist government go? Where did the National Socialist government go? Their embassies are in Taiwan. All of these embassies are there for the World War II European governments and many Asian ones. And all of this is unrecognized by the United Nations. That's why Taiwan, even though it's one of the largest economies in the world, it's got 25 million people, but its economy is well beyond its population in terms of clout. It is one of the wealthiest nations on earth, and it produces the overwhelming majority of the world's computer hardware. If it were taken off the map by some horrible Holocaust, your computers would soon, your entire internet would soon cease to function in terms of much of its hardware and framework. Now, nevertheless, no one recognizes its existence. It's on a map only as some renegade province of China. There's no official acknowledgement of it. If you ask the United Nations about it, they'll say Nationalist Republic doesn't exist. It's the same way with the Third Reich. So these governments still exist in exile. They want nothing to do with the decadent or degenerate governments as they consider them in the rest of the world, and they are immune to prosecution because the United Nations has no power to investigate Taiwan's nuclear arsenal. They could investigate weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. They could investigate weapons of mass destruction in Russia. But these are members of the United Nations because they have no jurisdiction over Taiwan. Taiwan has one of the largest nuclear arsenals in the world. That's why China can never invade. But no one knows this. It's the same with the National Socialistic government in exile. That's the important thing to keep in perspective. Doctor?
Wow. Well, I just am like going, wow. How do we, all right, let me ask this question. So there is the government, and I'll use Taiwan, the government that sits on the outside, the one that our representatives and ambassadors go and negotiate with. And so what you're saying is that there is also this other government sitting underneath, or are they parallel? What's that relationship? You know, what's on the outside versus what's running everything?
You mean on the world in general, kind of like the world scene in general?
Well, using Taiwan as the example, there is the Taiwan that the United States recognizes as a country and, you know, our ambassadors will interact with. And then there is this government that you're talking about, but it doesn't sound like they're the same.
Okay. Oh, that's what confused me, and I apologize. That's what I miscommunicated. There is no government of the Nationalist Republic of China on the island of Taiwan that anyone interacts with. There are no embassies. There are illegal consulates, or what they would call goodwill offices, more properly. They're not even recognized as consulates. The difference between an embassy, of course, is one that sits in the capital of a nation state like Washington, D.C., the District of Columbia. A consulate would be some foreign representative office in San Francisco. Now, North Korea has these facilities. Taiwan has none of these. Taiwan will have secret offices that are run like underground businesses for mafios. They basically are like mafia dons. I'm not saying this to make them sound somehow repulsive or to make them sound somehow negative. This is just the reality of the situation. You've got one of the most powerful economies in the world that has the wealthiest quality of life on earth next to that of perhaps Japan. And other than that, you've got nobody recognizing that they exist. There are no embassies. There are no consulates. There's no diplomats. There's no statesmen. So the only thing that happens is unofficial visits will occur between some of their politicians, like the mayor of Taiwan, who later became the mayor of Taipei, the capital of Taiwan, who later became its president. He visited the United States before he became president so that he could do things unofficially here. The way the Taiwanese dealt with the Clinton administration was through Buddhist monks who bribed the Clinton administration to send carriers down to the Taiwan Straits when China started rattling sabers. So all of this is done by bribery and corruption on the part of the West. Now, in Taiwan, where I grew up, this is a fascist government. The salute is the Roman salute. The salute is that of the Sieg Heil. Now, this is what we display before our flag. No one in the world knows this. There is no one who even realizes there was a Taiwan. Now, why would they do this? Some might ask. The reality is, to the Chinese people, the swastika and the Hakenkreuz under the National Socialist regime was a sign of refuge and salvation, because it was Adolf Hitler who was still deciding between a formal alliance between nationalist China or imperial Japan at the time that the Americans created and generated the incident that caused the Nanjing massacre that led to war between Japan and the United States on the Chinese mainland. Now, at that time, he ordered Throop, one of his ambassadors in Shanghai, to fly the largest National Socialist flag ever created. It weighed half a ton. It was so huge you couldn't fly it. They had to put it over building rooftops. This acted as a huge field tent for Chinese to find shelter under from Japanese massacre. So to the Chinese people, the National Socialists are the good guys. This is why you will see many photographs of National Socialist uniforms on Chinese troops. If you ever take a look at Why We Fight, that old propaganda film made in World War II from the United States, they show you flat out, here's our allies, the Chinese, and they're all wearing Stahlhelm. They're all wearing Nazi uniforms. And you ask yourself, what's going on? And it doesn't make any sense. But of course, the Americans just nod their heads like an assembly line of hood ornaments and say, well, that's right. Where's our allies, the Chinese? I don't know why they're dressed like that, but, you know, at any rate, Chiang Kai-shek's son went to a National Socialist military academy and, of course, was trained by the German warfare techniques. So we have a situation in which that entire type of government and social system has made it to Taiwan. It's been extremely successful as an economy. It was the only economy which did not have a bubble burst like the Japanese and the Indonesians and the rest of the Asian tigers during the recession. It's totally immune to that economically because it's on a totally different economic system. It's also on a totally different military system. But you might ask, how did we get involved in this insane war? How did the U.S. get involved in that? Of course, is as I explained, it was 1937, but it was well before then. I've explained this on air a few times, so very briefly, the Americans installed a man named Durham White Stevens as the dictator of Korea. This was on September 15th of 1905, right after the Russo-Japanese War, and the Japanese were forced during the peace negotiations by the Americans to make the man, Durham White Stevens, who was basically a Japanese government advisor for their industry, they were forced to make him the foreign advisor to the Korean King Kojong. And this was a position of such importance that the New York Times obituary 4 years later said that he was known throughout Asia as the dictator of Korea. And this was an American, and this was in 1905. This would be the equivalent of the Japanese forcing the Americans to install a Japanese prime minister over Canada. And then the Americans, of course, in 1889 had invaded the Philippines, where they slaughtered millions of Filipino Muslims, 3 million. And this is why the Muslims hate Americans. So when the Americans slaughtered 3 million Filipino Muslims, how do you think the Japanese felt when they bordered directly by maritime border? Because at that time, Taiwan, the island of Taiwan, was an integral part of Japan. So at that point, the Japanese had a direct maritime border with the Philippines. This would have been the equivalent of the Japanese invading Mexico and slaughtering millions of Mexicans. Now, the Americans...
I think it's interesting that... we talk about the Nazis. I mean, they put people in concentration camps and did atrocious things. But if 10 years before, or however long ago it was before, we went into a country and killed off 3 million people that, looking at the Philippines, it doesn't look like they were prepared to deal with U.S. forces. Shame on us.
Oh, indeed. Indeed. And this is part of the horror of what generated the World War. So what we need to go into, of course, is how that war ended, or rather did not end the way people think it ended. I went a bit into, of course, how the war started. Obviously, America was very involved in what was essentially unlimited aggression, even as late as 1939, when all you ever read about is the National Socialists and the Soviet Union invaded Poland, and when they invaded Poland, they divided it in this act of unmitigated aggression. One of the things that you don't understand is, of course, that the Americans invaded Greenland, one of the largest islands in the world. In fact, the largest island in the world. It's so large that until very recently, geographers considered Greenland to be a continent. Now, the Americans invaded and occupied Greenland long before the Second World War was declared officially in Europe. And you have the Americans, just with this unprovoked act of aggression, invading these other nation states. It doesn't make it into the history books at all. And you have a situation, of course, where the Germans are preparing for war because of United States aggression, but the original people they were going to attack was the British Empire. They had an entire war plan, thousands of pages long, hundreds of volumes, that was written out by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt back when he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy in World War I. Now, before he was crippled by polio, Franklin Delano Roosevelt led an expedition on the American front. Whoa, wait a second. I didn't know there was an American front in World War I. Well, there was. And on this American front in World War I, we called it Haiti, or Haiti. Haiti was the world's first black republic. Every other black nation state before that point in history was an African kingdom. Now, the Haitians were renegade slaves who set up a slaves republic on Haiti. It was the second republic in the Western Hemisphere after the American Republic was established during the American War of Independence. Now, the Haitians were a thorn in America's side because they were a black republic. So what happened during World War I? President Roosevelt, later to be president, invaded while he was Assistant Secretary of the Navy, personally leading as Assistant Secretary of the Navy the United States Marine Corps Expeditionary Force. Now, he was responsible for so many atrocities. He killed so many blacks so horribly by impaling them or skinning them alive that his enemy, Gamaliel Harding, Warren Gamaliel Harding, one of the worst presidents we ever had in the White House, he was a diehard Klansman, an ardent racist, and he was someone who, under his administration, the Ku Klux Klan grew by leaps and bounds, its highest percentage of growth in all of its history, and yet he was able to win his position because he was able to expose to the American people, I may be a Klansman, but this other guy has skinned blacks alive and impaled them on sticks to bleed out through their anuses so slowly that they took days to die. So Roosevelt was proven to be such a criminal that a Klansman won over him in terms of his black racism. But everybody holds Roosevelt as this great democratic leader. This is the insanity of American history. So when you're confronted...
The part that I find amazing, Douglas, is that we don't even hear these stories coming out of Haiti, and we don't hear these stories coming out of China or Japan. I mean, that's the part that I find interesting.
Well, the reason that you don't is because the Department of Defense, which I worked for well nigh a decade, destroying documents for, runs your entire information system. What happened in 1994 was that the Department of Defense, through DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, and NASA, and the United States National Science Foundation, for the Digital Library Initiative, went to Stanford University of California, right here where I live, next to the Presidio military base. And they picked up a couple of students called Larry Page and Sergey Brin, and they paid them a multi-million-dollar contract to develop a search engine in 1998 that was commercialized as Google. And Google, of course, has an address. It's called google.stanford.edu. That's a federal address. That's a government address. And what does Google own? They own Google Chrome. They own Picasa. They own Mars, Earth, Universe. They own Google Books. They got third-party advertising. They own YouTube. They own the cloud and Google Buzz and Android and Gmail. And this is where you get all of your information. Now, with a woman who was running Google as one of its presidents or CEOs, she left and went to run Yahoo. So it's the same family of data mafia that runs whichever search engine that you're accessing. This is why you get no information.
You know, you sound like an infomercial.
Well, believe me, the government sold this, and they sold this to you thinking that you, as an information consumer, are offered a choice. Now, that's the funny part. I actually went to stand as part of jury duty. I was summoned to jury duty, and I actually was on the jury that was trying the brother of Marisa Myers. She's the chief executive officer from Google, who's now in charge of Yahoo, and her brother was using all this information that she gave him through the search engine to track down, rape, and beat up girls. Now, of course, they pointed out the fact that I had a dishonorable discharge from the Marine Corps, and I was kicked off the jury. But before I was kicked off, I saw enough to say that this guy needs to be strung up, or at least chemically castrated. But no, after they got me off the jury, everybody, of course, voted him off as this good Joe, and he's back loose on the internet looking for dates. That's they don't call it jury rigged for nothing. But definitely, aside from that, want you to know this is the data mafia from which you get your info.
It's just hard to, you know, I have guests come on the show and we talk about so many amazing things. And there are some things that, you know, that come across the airwaves that just blow your mind because we think that we're getting the information, or we blame the scientists, you know, we blame the historians, and we don't blame the government, you know. But if that is where really it's all starting, then maybe we need to change our perspective and take it off the academics and point it back to where it really needs to go.
Well, I'll tell you where it really needs to go. A lot is said about banksters, and that's a popular scapegoat. And certainly they're evil financial rapists, but they're really not the people with the power. It's not the men with the gold who make the rules. This isn't a golden rule world we live in. Rather, the golden rule is not who has the gold makes the rules. It's who has the guns makes the rules. And who are the men with the guns? The Department of Defense. There's your 1%. As I said, you take 100,000 bureaucrats out of the Department of Defense, put them together with all of your military branches of service, including the reserves and the National Guard. That would include, of course, the Coast Guard, etc. And what do you have? You have less than 1% of the American population. Yet this 1% gets over 51% of your discretionary fiscal budget through congressional vote every single year without fail. Now, how did we get to this point? Well, a lot of it has to do with World War I, which took us directly into World War II. And that started, of course, actually in Asia. You had a situation where an ardent communist by the name of, he wrote The Sea Wolf and the various, Jack London. Jack London was an American member of the Communist Party. He was also an extreme racist, and he wrote a novel, or a novella, a short story, we would call it today, called The Unparalleled Invasion. Now, in this novel, he advocated the extermination of the entire Sinitic population. Sinitic means Chinese or Vietnamese. These are both Sinitic ethnicities that speak the Sinitic language. There's a term called anti-Semitism, which means people who are pathologically xenophobic. very similar to the term anti-Semitism. No one knows about it in the West, but it's understood throughout Asia. Many Britons who ran the British Empire used to call the Chinese the Jews of Asia, specifically the overseas Chinese who dominated the petty capitalism throughout the Pacific Rim. Now, in order to exterminate all of this, Jack London recommended the use of unlimited biocidal weapons, biological weapons. Now, in 1910, this was published worldwide in many languages, including Japanese, called Collier's Magazine. It was published through the circular known as Collier's Magazine, which was one of the most well-read, well-distributed magazines in the world. And this was an open call to ethnic genocide of 25% of the world's population. At that time, the Chinese had 1 billion people. They constituted 1/4 of all mankind. 1 out of every 4 people on Earth was Chinese. That's why Jack London said, we've got to kill them all. Then we can move in and establish American democracy over a land of the dead. This is actually out there on PDF format for anyone who looks it up. Well, what happened during that year? During 1910, we experienced the Manchurian Plague. The Great Manchurian Plague was unleashed when a mysterious outbreak occurred that was transferring from marmots to human beings. And at that time, Manchuria was this Asian nation that was the headquarters of the dynasty, the Qing dynasty, that had administered China for hundreds of years. So all the Manchurians began to die off. As a matter of fact, today, out of a population of well over 1 billion people in China, less than a few hundred speak the Manchurian language. The reason why, one of the major factors, was this huge plague in 1910 that was generated by artificial means. Nobody was able to prove it, but Emperor Hirohito, as a young man, knew, as well as many local Asians, the Americans had launched it from Durham White Stevens' American-dominated Korea. And as a result...
No way, Douglas, no way.
He became a marine biologist when 60,000 Manchurians died in less than a year. That's when Emperor Hirohito said, I'm going to become a marine biologist and I'm going to defend Asia from American aggression using weapons of biological mass destruction. Now, Americans had known all about this from the years going back to the American Revolutionary War. What had happened during the American Revolutionary War was that the American revolutionary founding fathers were instigating a conservative insurgency. This was the world's first revolution of the modern age that was based on a bunch of conservatives who were a bunch of plantation-owning slave owners. And they said, we want more. What had happened was King George of the English Empire said, this far and no further, and he drew what was called the Royal Proclamation, saying that the American colonies were going to stay stuck behind the Appalachian Mountains, they weren't going to move further west, and the American Indians could live on in peace. Now, the American founding fathers wanted none of that. They said, we want it all. And so what had happened was they launched a war to get it all against the British. This was called the American Revolutionary War of Independence.
Wait. Hold on. What you're saying is that our violence against the Native American population was all, well, I mean, we all know it was a land grab, but that England didn't want to do it, and so that's why the Revolutionary War happened, so that we could do the land grab?
Absolutely. All people need to look up is the Royal Proclamation. All people need to look up is the Royal Proclamation of North America, and they'll find all the information that they need to get started on realizing what true villains the founding fathers were. Now, these villains had their problems. One of their biggest problems was that they kept running all of their plantations on African slaves. Now, these poor African slaves fought back using something called smallpox, quite by accident, mind you, but nevertheless, it began to decimate the American armies because all of the black slaves were serving them their food and bringing them their supplies and doing all the heavy lifting. So the American white troops that were whipping them suddenly got sick, and they all started dying of smallpox. Well, George Washington had learned from Cotton Mather, a fanatical Puritan who used to live during the days of America's theocracy, back when the Puritans landed at Plymouth Rock shortly thereafter. Cotton Mather grandfather was a man who advocated the extermination of all Indians as the spawn of Satan, but he learned something, a trick from an African slave on how to deal with smallpox. And we call it today vaccination. Back in the days of George Washington, they called it variolation. And what George Washington did was he took smallpox from running open pustules from the troops that were infected. He cut open a small paper cut on all of his troops that weren't infected, and he infected them with smallpox. They came down with a small case that they quickly built an immunity to. This was magic. Back in those days, variolation. Today it's called vaccination, and it's required for anyone who joins the military. So you have this situation where he saved his army and won the revolution. If it hadn't been for his vaccination, he wouldn't have been able to have won against the British because all his troops would have died of smallpox. Those that didn't die were deserting. Because all the Americans knew all about biological warfare, that's how they began to apply it to the American Indians. This was how they won World War I. When about that time, William Henry Welch, who was the single most powerful individual in the history of American medicine, approached Surgeon General Gorgas, and he said, there's a war going on in Europe, and our president, Woodrow Wilson, wants to get in on this war, but he knows he can't win. Now, you might ask yourself, how is it he knows he can't win? Because at that point in time, very close to the end of World War I as we know it, the Germans had won the war. This is something which doesn't go into any history books, but if you look it up, you'll find out what I say is true. You can look up the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. It is spelled Brest after the city, B-R-E-S-T, hyphen, and then Litovsk, L-I-T-O-V-S-K. Now, the Brest-Litovsk Treaty came into being with the Bolsheviks. The Bolsheviks went in, had a civil war with the Tsar, who abdicated. They annihilated his family. They established a revolutionary government that was too weak to fight the Kaiser. So they surrendered 1/3 of their population to the Germans, 25% of their territories, and half of their industries. Think about what I'm saying. 1/4 of their territories and 50% of their industries, as well as 1/3 of their population, went to Germany. At that point, the Kaiser was invulnerable. He had won everything Adolf Hitler later wanted. And with that, he was mobilizing all of these troops. He was going to roll into the West, and the American Expeditionary Forces were going to be nothing but speed bumps. So they were under a conundrum. Woodrow Wilson was saying, I want to get involved in this war so bad, but we can't defeat the Kaiser. So he turned to John D. Rockefeller. And John D. Rockefeller said, well, I've got these two jackasses, Welch and the Surgeon General of your army named Gorgas, and they're working with my Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research. That's what's now known as Rockefeller University. And they said, we've been studying George Washington and what was done during the American Revolutionary War, and we think we can make you a disease that'll win you this war, and you can redraw the map of Europe any way you want. And Woodrow Wilson said, go for it. So when he gave the executive order, they took conscripts out of San Quentin Prison here in California. All of this was on record through the Letterman Army Medical Center, where as a Department of Defense research librarian, I had to collate and destroy documents. Now, the Letterman Army Medical Center is today George Lucas's Industrial Lights and Magic Company. Because the entire Presidio military base was closed due to a number of scandals like this, they destroyed all of the records, and they destroyed the Letterman Army Medical Center. Now, the reason this is so significant is not only because it was the Pentagon of the United Nations, but Letterman Army Medical Center trained 25%, fully 1/4 of all U.S. Army doctors. And as a result, they were trained in the military fashion. When you become a military doctor, they pay for your medical education. And guess what? As a military doctor, you don't do the Hippocratic Oath. You're immune from the Hippocratic Oath. So as a military doctor, your job is to hurt people, not to help them. So Surgeon General Gorgas and any Surgeon General, well, a Surgeon General. Think about what I'm saying. Your Surgeon General, the man who gives you orders from the top, he's a military man. Your Surgeon General wears a uniform. The Surgeon General of the United States is not subject to the Hippocratic Oath. Is any of this sinking in?
It is sinking in, but it's just kind of like...
So the Surgeon General Gorgas got together with Welch. They went to San Quentin, and they basically conscripted a bunch of convicts, and they put them in unrefrigerated boxcars to go to Fort Lewis and Fort Leavenworth and various other cantonments in Kansas. And they created what was known as the American Army flu. Now, all flus are avian flus. All flus are swine flus. All flus are Asian flus. The reason why is because all flus come out of Asia. That's why they're always the Taiwan flu, the Hong Kong flu, the Tokyo flu. Everything you get is some crud out of Asia. Why is that? Because you have the majority of the world's population living on subsistence agriculture, and they live with their pigs and they live with their chickens. And as a result, the avian flu, all flus are avian, the entire biomass of all birds in the world is a vector for influenzas that do not hurt them, because these viruses evolved in the stomach linings of dinosaurs millions and millions of years ago. And as the dinosaurs died off and devolved into what we know today as the avian population, the birds, that entire flight of birds all over the globe is a biomass for evolution of influenza. All of human life, all 9 billion of us on planet Earth are sloppy seconds. We're a fly speck on the windshield of viral life. But when they don't have birds, they'll take us. And they transfer to us through pigs, because the pigs are so similar to humans in their anatomy that we use porcine valves to replace leaky heart valves in humans. So because they're so similar to us, we catch diseases they catch. That's why all flus are avian. That's why they're all swine. That's why they all come out of Asia through that subsistence agricultural system. This is why all Asians bow and do not shake hands, so that they do not pass the flu. And what happened, of course, was the Americans created their own right here in the United States. They sent all these convicts to Kansas in unrefrigerated boxcars with live chickens that they were told they were going to eat once they were there at Kansas. Well, the chickens ate them first. And the chickens, of course, had all kinds of fecal matter, droppings, shed their feathers, created what was known as chicken roll in all of the convicts. And by the time they got to Kansas, they were all infected with H1N1, hemagglutinin 1, neuromodase 1, the avian swine flu, the killer flu, artificial, totally new on the planet, never before generated. And of course, they found some poor dope named Walter Gitchell, and he was immune, but he was a carrier. So they made him to cook. So he was cooking for thousands of men. They all contracted it. They were all forced to sleep together, literally like a pajama party in bunks next to each other. And by the time they were sent to Europe, the majority of them were dying. They arrived in Spain, which was this neutral nation that the Americans paid reparations to because of all the colonies, like the Philippines, they had stolen from them in the Spanish-American War. And they paid them reparations so the Spanish would allow the Americans to land. So when the Americans landed, they landed in what were called coffin ships, because the majority of them arrived dead. And that's why we got the name Spanish flu. But in all the records, it's known as the American Army flu. Then the Americans got into the trenches with their British allies and the French, and everybody got sick, and they killed more people in 24 hours than AIDS killed in 24 years. They killed more people in a single year than the Black Plague killed in 100 years. They killed 100 million people worldwide. And that's how America won World War I. And that's why the National Socialistes hated America. That's why when Adolf Hitler came to power, he said, I hate Americans, and I'm going to do everything I can to get back at them. And this
But if it was all hush-hush in America, how did these other countries or other leaders find out what was really going on?
It was quite obvious, because it came out of America. There was no such thing as a non-Asian flu. It's entirely unnatural. If you look up in history, every single influenza is an Asian influenza. The Black Plague came out of Mongolia. That wiped out 2/3 of the European population. All of this was due to the Mongol Empire and the spreading of the giant Asian gerbil, which was the carrier, not the European black rat. All of this has been medically proven. Every scientist or biologist of the day knew the Americans had done this. Every government knew the Americans had done this. The only people who didn't know it was the American public. And everybody, of course, died. By that I mean there was blowback. It was the equivalent of a nuclear war. It would be like if the high command went to Ronald Reagan and said, we're at strategic parity with the Soviet Union in terms of nuclear warheads. If we give a first launch now, if you initiate it, we'll take out all their major silos. They'll strike back with their surviving silos and their dead man switch, and they'll kill 100 million people. And it would be like if they said that to him and he said, well, we got 300 million people. Who cares? Go for it. That's exactly what it was with Woodrow Wilson. 20 million Americans died. And they all died so quickly that they ran out of coffins in the first week. There are entire cities where there are unmarked graves with tens of thousands of people in them throughout the United States and all of its major cities. They had to bury them using pile drivers. because they couldn't find enough men left alive to do the job. They had to actually use bulldozers of the day. So this is the kind of mass death and mega death that we're talking about. That's how World War I ended. Everyone knew it except an American. Because why? Because you go on Google and you say, what does my Google tell me? What does my Yahoo tell me? Well, it don't tell you jack spit. That's what it don't tell you.
But that's but that's what's in all the history books too. I mean, it's not even just Yahoo and Google and that kind of thing.
True, because all of these records were Army records in which it was noted as the American Army flu. So in American and English-speaking textbooks, this is published, but anyone who's a medical doctor knows better. Anyone who's an MD will truly, if you present them this information, would say, yes, what Douglas Dietrich is saying is undeniable. There has never been a non-Asian flu in history before. This is highly anomalous. What was its source? Then you'll see Camp Funston in Kansas, United States. Highly irregular. Doesn't make any sense. But that's where they set up SAMS, the Strategic Armed Military Services. Their high command indoctrination center for all your Army officers was set up there because this was where they had won World War I. This was how they were planning on winning World War II. But they lost their ass because the Japanese developed far better bioweapons. And they developed them first before the Americans could get to them. Another example of World War II Americans don't know about is, of course, Fort Dietrich. No relation to me, I assure you. My name ends with a CH. Fort Dietrich ends with a CK. And Fort Dietrich was set up under the highest levels of security clearance. So high, it was well above the Manhattan Project. So whenever you take a look at the Manhattan Project and they say, this was the highest level of security, and it's never went higher than this, this is the apex, it's all a lie. None of that is true. You can look up Fort Dietrich and its security clearances, and you'll find out it was much higher. This is what they were counting on to win the war, and it was run by George Merck, the man who wrote the Merck Manual, which is the pharmaceutical manual, which is used as a training manual for all pharmacists or pharmacological MDs throughout the United States. And George Merck, how did he make his fortune? Bioweapons. That was how he made it, produced at Fort Dietrich. And so when they were administering what they were at Fort Dietrich in Maryland, you had armed guards with machine guns that had authority to kill you if you forgot your ID card. If a scientist exited that camp and he didn't have his ID card coming back, they had authority to shoot him. That was how high it was. The Manhattan Project had nothing like that. And the whole point of Camp Dietrich was to take things like botulinum toxin. And botulinum toxin is one of the most poisonous compounds known to science. It paralyzes muscles, including the diaphragm, without which the lungs can't function. And they actually refined it so that by concentrating a pound of it, if they properly dispersed it, they could, in theory, kill 1 billion people. They could kill all of China. But the Japanese got there first, and the Americans were forced to sue for peace. They had all that botulinum toxin prepared to kill everybody in Asia, and they couldn't unleash it because the Japanese had it first. And so the Americans sued for peace and lost the war. Of course, Americans know none of this. They don't know, so they're given this fairy tale about, but we made this bomb, and we dropped this bomb on Japan, and this Big Bang ended the war like an orgasm, like a fairy tale, right? And everybody just goes, yeah, that feels good. I like that. That feels good. It tickles. I believe it. I believe it. Of course, it had nothing to do with reality or the end of the war because it did nothing to hurt the Japanese war machine. You had 100 million Japanese in China. They were going to stay in China under the auspice of my nationalist government, which later moved to Taiwan, and they were there totally untouched by the atomic bombs, which succeeded in killing women, children, infants in their cribs, seniors in their beds, and absolutely, statistically, nobody else. And in terms of the Americans launching a terrorist weapon, all they had to do was wind up paying the price for it. The Americans were forced to clean the mess up. It was American Marines and Army divisions that were sent in to clean up Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and all of those men died by the thousands of radiation cancer. Now, that's not the position of a victorious power. Do the Americans know of any of this? No, of course not, because they can't find it. But if they look it up, atomic veterans, they'll find out everything I'm saying is true. So this is how the war went down. And the Russians didn't win it either. The Russians were...
Well, you know what? Wait,
Yeah.
Douglas. Don't even go there because we need to go to commercial break in like a minute. So
Yes,
let's just breathe, Douglas. Breathe. One of the things I love about you is that you are so freaking passionate about what you speak on, you know, and so knowledgeable about what you speak on. But I just find it amazing that there's what we hear, and then there is the total spin. And as you were talking, you know, there are the viruses and, you know, like Ebola and AIDS that came out of Africa. So see, it's not just, you know, things coming out of China and Japan. You know, it has to come out of Africa too, because that makes it be fair.
No, what comes out of Africa are what we know as hemorrhagic viruses. These are totally different. They're not influenzas. And hemorrhagic viruses kill a person so quickly that they cannot spread. That's why they're called hot zones or burning zones, depending on the ferocity of the viral breakout. When you talk about Marburg or green monkey virus, these kinds of viruses come from primates to human beings, when, of course, the primates are far more interactive with the civilian or the farmers, the agriculturalists in Africa than they are in China, where they stay in the mountains. So in Africa, what you have are cases of a very different kind of disease that basically has led to a lot of the village type of demographic distribution in Africa. One of the reasons why
Wait.
Yeah.
I got we need to go to break. Okay?
Yes, ma'am.
All right. I'm Dr. Rita Louise. We're here talking to Douglas Dietrich. His webpage is Douglas Dietrich.
Just Energy Radio with your host, Dr. Rita Louise, will return right after these messages.
You're listening to IRN, the Inception Radio Network, Chicago, Illinois.
Are you looking for a cure for boredom? Never worry. IRN's new interactive website introduces a number of ways to pass time while you listen to your favorite show. Choose anything from the IRN Chat Lounge, the Game Lounge, Video Lounge, or the Mood Lounge. These fun, exciting features let you chat in real time with fellow listeners, view live skywatches, play daily posted online games, or pick a show based on topic. The choices are endless. Use your time wisely, keeping it all on IRN.
Who were the gods of antiquity? They've been described as the forces of nature, levels of consciousness, and aspects of our psyche. Stories that depict their incredible weapons, their flying machines, and their amazing adventures are characterized as being the product of our ancestors' fanciful imaginations. But what if the tales of the gods are true? Did the writers, chroniclers, and scribes of our distant past actually document a realistic view of our origin? My latest book, Man-Made, The Chronicles of Our Extraterrestrial Gods, looks at our most ancient legends. Learn of the torrid romances, elaborate plots, violent scandals, and conspiracies that played out in antiquity. Find out the role the gods played in the life and culture we have today. If you want to find out the truth of who we are and where we come from, order your copy of Man-Made today. For more information, go to www.manmadethechronicles.com. That's www.manmadethechronicles.com.
Hello, Inception Radio Network listeners. This is Amanda. Remember, you can take your Inception Radio shows on the go. Just download the Inception Radio Network app for your iPhone, iPad, or Android smartphones and access live shows, past shows, guest lineups, and much more. Just visit the iTunes Store or the Google Play Marketplace and download it today for free.
crossroads in your life and discover alternative solutions to your deepest concerns at soulhealer.com. So whether it's a physical problem, an emotional issue, a question about work, or troubles in your relationships, naturopath and medical intuitive Dr. Rita Louise can help you. Bring peace, harmony, and health back into your life. Schedule a session today. Visit soulhealer.com right away and live the life you've been dreaming of.
You didn't forget what's coming up tonight, did you? Hi, Inception Radio Network listeners. This is Amanda. Never miss that interview you were looking forward to or the show on your favorite topic. Follow IRN on Twitter, I_R_N, and get reminders about the evening's live shows as well as fun and important updates throughout the week. That's I_R_N, and never miss a great show again.
We only have a couple of seconds before we have to get back to the show, and I want to tell you how you can jumpstart your intuition today. Using my free 50-page introductory guide filled with simple, revolutionary, and proven techniques, you can ignite your intuition and tap into your inner wisdom, all from the comfort of your own home. The Institute of Applied Energetics is the leader in online home study instruction for those interested in becoming a certified medical intuitive, intuitive counselor, or energy medicine practitioner. Now is the time to transform your life and take it to a completely new level. Discover who you are and how you work. Open the door to the world of intuition, health, and healing. You can jumpstart your intuition right away by going to www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com and downloading our free guide. Get the opportunity of a lifetime and live the life you deserve. Download your free Jumpstart Your Intuition guide today at www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com and begin living a life filled with passion and purpose.
Don't have a computer? Is your internet connection down? Don't worry. Use your trusty cell phone or landline and call into our listen line at 401-283-6700 to listen to the Inception Radio Network 24/7. Again, that call-in number is 401-283-6700. For the Inception Radio Network, I am MJ.
Hello, Inception Radio Network. Would you like your favorite show to be played again live on air? Well, now the choice is in your hands with IRN's live request portal, an easy way to request your favorite show with a simple click. IRN's live request portal now gives you exclusive access to all the shows. How easy is it? Simply type a show name or a guest name, click request, even write a dedication message, and that's it. Try it now. Simply visit InceptionRadioNetwork.com, click on the Live Request tab under the show menu. Now playing your favorite show is just a mouse click away.
Go deep inside yourself and venture into the realm of the unconscious mind with my Meditating on the Kabbalah guided imagery audio CDs. Discover who you are and what you want in life. Meditating on the Kabbalah can help you to open, clear, and revitalize the energetic pathways of your subtle being. They will support you in your spiritual quest by helping you to access the profound insights and inner guidance you need as you work in alignment with your highest good. Let them help you to release negative thoughts and emotions and clear away any limitations that may be keeping you from experiencing your full potential. Walk down the path to health, healing, understanding, and enlightenment with Meditating on the Kabbalah. Order your copy today at www.soulhealer.com. That's right, that's www.soulhealer.com.
And now back to Just Energy Radio with Dr. Rita Louise.
Hello and welcome back to Just Energy Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Rita Louise, and thank you all for staying tuned to the second hour of the show. Just Energy Radio is brought to you by the Institute of Applied Energetics. That's www.appliedenergeticsinstitute.com, where you can jumpstart your intuition today by downloading their free 50-page guide. Just think, you can learn to become a medical intuitive, intuitive counselor, or energy medicine practitioner, all from the comfort of your own home. We've been here talking to Douglas Dietrich about whatever happened to World War II. But before the break, Doug, why do I keep wanting to call you Derek? Douglas. Oh, and his webpage is douglasdietrich.com. But before the break, we were talking about the avian flu, and then I brought up things that are coming out of Africa like AIDS and Ebola, and you corrected me and said that they were hemorrhagic fevers, which I'm not exactly sure what the difference between the two are, because, you have sick and dying people, so that's, they're sick and dying. But in the stuff that we find coming out of Africa, I mean, what comes to my mind is AIDS, how it just miraculously appeared in the human population. Are you finding that there is some kind of, hand helping it move into human populations and thus spreading around the world?
Absolutely, and it almost certainly is United States federal government, and the United States federal government is nothing other than a military junta. Everything that you have in your United States is not a government. You do not have an electoral system. All of that is totally delusional. Anybody who thinks that voting makes a difference between the two parties, Republican and Democrat, is obviously, at this point, extremely naive, to be generous. But even the Americans who consider themselves a bit more cynical or sophisticated, who try to go for an independent party or the like, a lot of these people just really aren't facing up to the fact. And the fact was that by the time the Second World War was under full sway, you had a military government, because Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was dying. And while he was dying, everything was run by essentially a duopoly, a dual government of the United States Army and the United States Navy, which meant ultimately General Marshall and Admiral King. And these two men were running the government. They had 27 million Americans in uniform. To put this into perspective for you, the Chinese Communist military on the mainland today at full mobilization would equate to about 3 million men. So that is nothing compared to what the Americans had. They could have marched over the earth. And obviously they didn't, because they lost. So you've got these men in charge who have lost, and they have to create a psychotic, delusional fantasy to maintain a draft and to maintain getting all of your money. Now, they are responsible for these diseases ultimately, because it's that organization that controls everything in your United States. Google, I've exposed as DARPA. It's just a sub-branch of the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. All of your medical hospitals subcontract to military research. All of your academia contracts to military research. There is nothing that you have in journalism that's not embedded from the military. So in the end, it all comes down to Hollywood. How do you perceive it? Through the military. When you watch Top Gun, when you watch the invasion of Los Angeles or the battle thereof, when you watch Independence Day, you see all of these military planes and helicopters. Now, at the time of the Battle of Los Angeles, the film, we had a situation where an entire squadron of Marine Corps helicopters with crews was used to give the special effects for that film. As in Independence Day, you had genuine military planes or Top Gun. There are not actors flying these helicopters or these planes. These are genuine military personnel from the Navy, from the Marine Corps. None of them are going to be doing what they're doing unless your film is essentially a recruiting ad. So all of that you're watching in popular media is for the military. There's nothing you get that's not run by the military. You are a civilian population run by less than 1% of the population that has all of the big guns. So this is what's causing these diseases through the research that's coming out of places originally like Fort Dietrich, which has since been decommissioned, but its research has spread to other covert installations. Now, in terms of what we were talking about with AIDS, it's important to remember that AIDS is not a natural virus as we know it. AIDS is rDNA. It's ribodeoxynucleic acid. It's a very primitive molecular chain. It's a single strand helical structure. Now, that's far more ancient than deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA, which is a double helical structured strand. Now, this biological or genetic, this molecular material for genetics is, of course, DNA, as we're familiar with it, evolved in the oceans. All of planet Earth was once a single ocean, buried under a single ocean, smothered under it. There was geophysically, according to any paleogeologist, a genuine global flood millions of years ago. Out of that flood, we are theorized to have evolved as life throughout the world, throughout the oceans, which contain the majority of the world's life. But our DNA, ribodeoxynucleic acid, of which comprises AIDS, that evolved on Mars. That evolved on the deserts of Mars, which was an arid world in which there was no water. It cannot exist in water. It does not thrive in water. It could never have evolved in water. It evolved in an arid desert environment. So it is this alien virus that has been weaponized and distributed amongst the African population, amongst the heterosexuals. Yet somehow in the degenerate West up north, in Europe and in America in particular, it somehow manifested only in homosexual individuals for decades. How is this possible? It doesn't make any sense. It had to be through vaccination. It had to be through an unleashing using primate delivery vectors or the same mechanisms that deliver the green monkey or Marburg type virus or the hemorrhagic fevers throughout Africa as a population control mechanism. Because statistically, the way African population is expanding exponentially, guaranteed if things continue without some massive catastrophe, this is going to be a black planet. You're going to have more people in Nigeria alone. The nation of Nigeria is about the size of Texas, contains an enormous amount of oil. So it's got the largest economy in Africa right now, the largest developing urban environment, which is very un-African. The African dispersal of villages throughout the entire continent was because of these types of fevers. When these fevers first evolved naturally, meaning the hemorrhagic fevers, not AIDS, things like Ebola, which was originally known as Ebola or Zaire Ebola, in the hot Congo out of Africa, you have a situation where it spreads so fast that it'll burn out before it can spread and become pandemic, before it can envelop entire nations. So as a result, these things never become epidemic. They will wipe out a village. This is why villages stay separate from each other and they don't develop into cities. This is why Africa never developed. One of the major reasons was so that they could close off their village to prevent incomers who might be carriers or vectors of plague. So as a result, Africa maintained a certain level of development for very practical reasons, and that's why it was the white man's grave, where for malaria, various other symptoms, that would overtake foreigners who came into the continent. This is why the Ebola that developed so recently on the Ivory Coast came out of a lab, was because originally Zaire Ebola, or the Zaire Ebola, it's in these hot, humid regions in the rainforest of Central Africa. They don't spread to more arid or temperate regions like the Ivory Coast. And what is in the Ivory Coast? What's in the Ivory Coast is all of America's former slaves, all of the British Empire's former slaves, the two nations that are English-speaking, Sierra Leone and Liberia. What happened was when the British said, we're not going to have no more slavery, they dumped all of their blacks into Sierra Leone, and they speak English there with what they call the King's English, or an English accent. And in Liberia, President Lincoln said, I am freeing all the slaves, now let's free America of all these blacks. So he started deporting millions of slaves to this place called Liberia on the coast next to Sierra Leone. So Liberia became this African slave nation that always considered itself the 51st state of the United States. It flies an American flag. It's 13 bars with a single star. Their currency is the only nation on earth that uses the United States dollar as their official currency. This is why for years when you're up late at night watching late night television, you'd see commercials for, here's this President Bush coin minted in Liberia, Clinton coins. Anyone who's alive that's illegal in the United States to mint, they'd mint it in Liberia. And they'd put stamps of living people in the United States, presidents, celebrities, and the like. This was all done out of Liberia for decades before they descended into total anarchy. Now that they're in anarchy, they've been saying, we want American basically acceptance as a 51st state. And America is saying, how do we respond to this? I know, let's unleash Ebola! And that's why outside of Liberia, there's an island called Monkey Island. And on Monkey Island, they were breeding all kinds of hemorrhagic fevers. And they were doing this for years, for just this moment in time when those pesky former slaves that were deported by Lincoln would say, hey man, we want back in! And then they unleashed it, and they wound up killing the chocolate industry worldwide, because where's all the world's chocolate grown? In the Ivory Coast of Africa. And as a result, they started having people who couldn't show up for work, and the chocolate prices skyrocketed, and everybody's saying, the death of chocolate, now you're going to have to pay an extreme price for it. And of course that would destroy all of civilization, because then of course all the women
because it's chocolate.
Yes, would kill us. So we have to, it's the end of the world, obviously. These are the kinds of repercussions they never think of. But this is some of what we're dealing with the kind of politics that we're dealing with. Now, there's another kind of development that people have, and it's important to maintain a kind of international perspective on this. I've been talking about America losing its ass in the war. What about its allies? Well, we have a situation, say, for instance, with the Russians and the British. I'll go into the Russians first, because there's this enormous myth that is propagandized by the Russians themselves, and for a long while in America by Russophiles. Now, Russophiles would, to this day, in this day and age, in the postmodern scene, include Alex Jones. Now, I happen to be a fan of Vladimir Putin, too, to an extent. Vladimir Putin is charismatic. He's this guy who's doing the best he can with a situation in total meltdown. Now, the guy's former KGB, but the Communist Party is outlawed, and he acts essentially as a new czar. So you've got this man setting up an imperial Russian system, but he's working with basically a system that is unworkable. It's not just the system itself that is the legacy of communism. It's also, unfortunately, the Russian people themselves who suffer from all of those abuses under decades of communism, which has led to basically massive amounts of alcoholism that are so universal that they make Irish and Scots look like teetotalers. And as a result, you've got, during the reign of Mikhail Gorbachev, for instance, a situation in which the Russian state had to invest in studies of the effects of seminal injection into the uterus at the time of conception as impacted by alcohol imbibement. And the reason that they had to do this was because of the infant retardation due to intoxication of the father at the moment of conception. This was the only nation on earth and the only nation in history that ever needed to do that. The major cause of the rapid decline of the lifespan in the average Russian male is due to alcoholism. So we've got this death of young fathers, and this is why Russian women have had so many abortions, because state-sponsored abortion was safe and it was legal in Russia, and women would rather abort their child than give birth to a retarded child with extensive fetal alcohol syndrome damage. This is the kind of challenge that Putin is working with. He's got a demographic collapse. The Russians are flirting with extinction. They have no population in which to take advantage of their enormous resources. They've got more oil than would come out of the Persian Gulf Emirates on the islands they stole from Japan in World War II. Sakhalinsk and the Kursk Islands chains, known as Tsushima in Japan and Iturup. Now, these island chains were developed with an extensive oil infrastructure to pump out that oil and natural gas by South Koreans. There's no Russians there to develop the infrastructure. Everyone who lives there is a South Korean. There's no Russians left in the Far East of any demographic consequence. Siberia is wide open. Russia is not a world power. Anyone who thinks it is sorely misinformed. And, of course, Vladimir Putin's going to do his best to propagandize it. Now, one of the ways that this is done is by his government and many governments before him through the Soviet era, and many Americans who were pro-communist, or many ultra-conservative reactionary Americans who were trying to pump a delusional, entirely fictitious Soviet threat. All of these people kept talking about the Soviet giant that won World War II, how they could have done anything they wanted, and they basically were running everyone over with their war machine. Well, between 1970, when the Bolsheviks first took over, and 1945, they were so impacted by civil wars, famines, plagues, purges, and invasions that communist Russia suffered over 130 million fatalities. That was the equivalent of losses expected in an all-out thermonuclear exchange had one occurred in the mid-1970s. And the depopulation of the greater Russian ethnos, meaning those that were not Belarusian or White Russian, or those that were not Ukrainian or Little Russian, it has never recovered. The Slavic Russian populations have been declining inexorably since the post-1945 baby bump. They face marginalization that parallels the experience of many Aboriginal tribes. And Stalin's reign of terror was to last nearly another decade. And under his rule, basically, there was another 100 million dead. And at 1945, they already had such a population decline that they were probably treading the waterline with what foreign demographers concluded was only 170 million survivors. Now, this is just outrageous when you think about 170 million survivors. To put this into perspective for you, that's when they included all of their suspect minorities. That means Jews, Germans, Chechens, Tatars, Poles, Finns, every place that they had conquered in Eastern Europe, in the Caucasus, in Mongolia. All of that combined was 170 million. If you took all that away, they were left with 100 million people who were actually Russian. What does that equal to? That is beneath the population of Japan in 1945. Japan had 100.
Living in Russia is like saying I want to live in South Dakota. Who wants to live there?
Well, people, are unaware of how far north Russia is. If you truly take a look at a map, all of it, is at the polar climes of Sweden, at the polar climes of Finland, the Scandinavian countries. And people keep populating this with immense forest instead of arid tundra. They have this idea that all that space is filled with people. It's all empty. But what I've said really should clinch it for people. Outside of Moscow and a few satellite cities like Novosibirsk in Siberia, which is essentially the capital of Siberia, aside from a few cities like that, there's nobody. And altogether, those few cities contain all the population, 100 million people. Japan at the end of World War II had 120 million people. Another aspect of Japan's winning the war, what was their major problem in 1945 Japan? Does anyone remember? Hold up your hands in class, people. Of course, no one remembers. It was overpopulation. Their major problem was facing starvation because there was too many people to feed. And Americans have this insane, psychotic, fantastic delusion that they killed all the Japanese off with nuclear bombs and strategic bombing, when in truth, more industry on the islands of Japan was damaged by domestic earthquakes than was damaged by American strategic bombing. That's a fact. And Americans, of course, know none of this. So how can people say the Russians won the war? They'll say, oh, well, all of their sacrifice, all of the population that they lost, that only proves everything I'm exposing as reality. You cannot win on the basis of losing all your population. But beyond that, why would a man like Patton think that he could have rolled in all the way to Moscow and eliminated the communist regime? Because basically the Soviets had nothing. All of the Soviets had gained was due to the West. This is nothing as anti-Russian. This is nothing Slavophobic or racist. This is reality. Basically, what had happened was the Soviet logistical train was American-made trucks. Even their trademark Soviet weapon, the Stalin's Ordigan, was nothing but a mounting of rocket launchers on an American truck bed. So on all of this, the cessation of Lend-Lease immediately created maintenance problems of terminal velocity throughout the Soviet war machine. 1/3 of the German trucks broke down in the first 2 weeks of invading Russia in 1941. You can imagine what it would be like for the Russians with all these American-made trucks had they suddenly found themselves at war with the West. And basically, you had this incredible, overwhelming tactical and strategic air power, undisputed naval power. The Soviet Union would have no coastal possession that was safe because most of it was icebound. What few coastal possessions it had were exposed. There was no way the Russians could have met the American Navy on the high seas. And American manpower, while never as efficiently used as some of its other counterparts, was untouched relatively by the conflict, whereas the serious Russian losses had taken their toll throughout all of the ranks. This is why when Stalin had the Battle of Berlin, he basically had a situation in which the industrial resources, the military manpower remaining to Germany, even after the destruction of Army Group Center, which was far more calamitous or catastrophic than Stalingrad, that was still being intelligently used. But the Soviets, they were at the bottom of their manpower barrel. No one ever talks about this. Despite the flush of Lend-Lease equipment, in the final assault on Berlin in 1945, Stalin warned both Zhukov and Konev there were no replacements. They had nothing left. There was nothing by which to advance into Western Europe. The Battle of Berlin destroyed them. And at that point, the only thing that kept them up was foreign aid. That is all that ever kept them up. So this whole idea, without the diversion of all of the German resources for D-Day and the strategic bombing, just in terms of the application of anti-aircraft power, the various kinds of jet propulsion technologies, all of these resources diverted to the West are the only reason that Russia ever got as far as it did. It certainly in no way, shape, or form won the Second World War any more than it won the First World War. And in the First World War, not only did the Germans win everything I described through the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, but Austria-Hungary and Turkey won all of their gatherings from the Soviet Union as members of the Central Powers. As allies of Germany, Turkey was awarded all of Georgia, all of Armenia, all of Azerbaijan. Had that not been destroyed by the American application of the American Army flu, what we know as the H1N1, or avian swine flu, the Spanish flu of 1918 to 1919, had that not happened, Turkey would be a major power in the Caspian Sea today with oil and natural gas coming out of Azerbaijan and coming out of ports in Batumi from Georgia. So you've got this whole situation the Americans destroyed, and that was a great Muslim empire that was dismantled in the wake of that massive pestilence, the 1918 flu. How could everybody in the world, Muslims, Germans, everybody, not hate the Americans? So you have this situation where World War II was made inevitable and the Allies lost. And people might say, well, what about Britain? Well, you had a situation that was so bad, they voted Churchill out of office during wartime. Now, nobody remembers this, including Britons. But if you take a look at the reality of the situation, what happened was after, quote-unquote, victory was declared in Europe, you've got this so-called peace, this ceasefire situation. They said, guess what? Churchill promised us blood, sweat, and tears. He's going to deliver. He only had more war to offer because at that point he said, oh, we got to take all our carriers. We've got to take all our troops. And we've got to invade Hong Kong and Singapore while the Americans try to invade Japan. Now, to put this into some perspective for people, the island of Okinawa is tiny. Americans say, we're still in Japan. And, of course, they're not in Japan. Okinawa is not in Japan. It is a separate nationality. It is a separate ethnicity. They eat pork. They are historically Sinitic, like the Chinese are Vietnamese. They fly a different flag. And Okinawa's like, you can look this up. So the Americans are occupying a different country in Asia, and they keep saying, the Eastern occupied Japan. And they deserve all of the mockery they get because they're that crazy, they're that delusional. But what happened on Okinawa? Aside from their horrific behavior, when the Americans invaded Okinawa, they basically raped, killed, tortured so many people to death slowly that more Okinawans killed themselves to avoid gang rape and torture to death, including being burned alive as children, by the Americans. Think about what I'm saying. Wrap your brain around this. More Okinawans killed themselves than Japanese died at Hiroshima and Nagasaki put together. That's how insanely atrocious American behavior in Okinawa was. And they're still there today. And the Japanese are trying to help the Okinawans to get rid of these pigs. Now, why do I use that term? Because every pig on the island of Okinawa is an American pig. They ate pork. They raised pigs. The Japanese were vegetarian. They weren't vegan. They ate fish. But your average Japanese person was so short because they were what we would consider today malnourished. They didn't eat meat protein. The Okinawans ate pork. So the Americans said, we're going to kill all the Okinawans by slaughtering every pig on the island of Okinawa. So they tracked down every single pig and killed every single pig on the island of Okinawa so the Okinawans would starve to death as a race by winter. So when the Japanese won the war, one of their first demands was, you Americans got to take all your pigs from America, bring them to the island of Okinawa, and repopulate the pigs on the island of Okinawa. So the Americans were forced to bring shipload after shipload of pigs. Every single pig on the island of Okinawa today is an American pig, including the servicemen. Now, that's the situation over there, and this was an invasion logistically larger than D-Day. In April 1st of 1945, when the Americans invaded Okinawa, this is this tiny island. On April 1st, All Fool's Day, April Fool's Day, 1945, that was larger. It was the largest and last invasion fleet ever assembled on Earth to this day. It was far larger than that engaged in the Normandy invasion of D-Day on June 6th of 1944. And basically the entire Marine Corps was lost. All of the experienced Marine divisions were lost, and deservedly so, for all the atrocities they committed on that island. Who was left to train new Marines? The point is, at that point, of course, Harry Truman said, we've got to use everything we've got. Of course he went for the atomic bomb. As futile as it was, as absurd as its deployment was, it's entirely understandable, because if that's what's going on that tiny little island, they can imagine what it was going to be like going into Japan. There's no way they could have carried it.
That doesn't even make any sense. So if that country is so small, why was it so hard for us to conquer it?
Because the entire population was resisting the Americans, who were taking old people and burning them alive for fun, and taking all the children and roasting them on spits and eating them. Of course the entire population resisted. And that's what it was going to be like in Japan every inch of the way. With the Americans behaving as abominably as they did everywhere in the world, nobody was going to die without fighting to the death. That's why it was so hard. That's why they invade Taiwan. Now, what's below Okinawa? The Ryukyu's island chain. Okinawa is the capital of the Ryukyu's island chain that for a long period of time belonged to China. What else belonged to China? The island of Taiwan. The Japanese won Taiwan away from China in the Sino-Japanese War of 1895. That's when Taiwan became a part of Japan. And at that point, the Americans had a decision: are we going to invade Taiwan, where all the Japanese air forces are installed, or do we invade Okinawa? If we invade the Okinawans, we'll have a Marine Corps invasion, but if we invade Taiwan, it's got to be an army invasion, much, much worse than Okinawa, makes D-Day look like nothing. They couldn't even get it together to invade Taiwan. So Taiwan was never invaded. And people can look this up in the history books. At 1945, what happened? Suddenly, the nationalist Chinese government during its civil war starts relocating to Taiwan with Japanese aid, and it would relocate over the next half decade till 1950, when the war legally ended between Japan and the United States. So you've got this whole situation in Asia no one's educated in, and Churchill wants in on this. Churchill says, yeah, I got to take all my carriers, we got to take all our troops out of Europe, and we're going to go into basically Hong Kong and Singapore. And by the way, think about this. In the first 24, 48, 72 hours that the Japanese conquered Indonesia, Hong Kong, Singapore, Vietnam, all of these island chains in the Southwest Pacific, in that 72 hours, all of the land that they conquered, so immense, mile after mile of land area, none of it was regained in half a decade of war with the United States, Britain, and Russia. All they captured was a bunch of these tiny little islands so that they could ultimately drop 2 bombs, which were totally futile in terms of their effect on the Japanese war machine. And in terms of all this, people say, what about the Soviets? The Russians won the war in the East. Well, as an example, during the entire Vietnam War, the communist North Vietnamese, the People's Democratic Republic of Vietnam, maintained an enormous air force of highly trained pilots. They scored more aces. There were a score of aces in that Vietnamese air force, about 20. The Americans, throughout the entire Vietnam War, decades of conflict, produced 2 aces. And so the Vietnamese Air Force was infinitely more professional. Beyond that, they had an enormous armor unit. They had a whole Panzerwaffe, or a mechanized force, of tanks. Why weren't their tanks deployed throughout the Vietnam War? Why weren't the American tanks running into Vietnamese tanks? Because they maintained all their tanks in the north to fight off the Chinese. So when the Americans retreated in 1973, the North Vietnamese went into Saigon with something like around 9 armored divisions that just plowed through the South Vietnamese army all the way to the capital of South Vietnam. And the Americans were saying, wow, where'd all these tanks come from? That was the situation in Manchuria. All of Japan's heavy armored units were in Manchuria. So Hirohito moved them all to Japan itself to surround Tokyo on the Kanto Plain in the event the Americans were crazy enough to invade Japan itself. Now, the moment all those heavy tanks were gone, Stalin said, I can make my grab. And Stalin rolled in with cavalry. Cavalry. And he rolled in and he met with Manchurian cavalry. The Japanese army, the Kwangtung army, was emasculated, all the heavy units gone, the Manchurian army was still there with cavalry, the Japanese infantry was there, and you had all these Soviet troops move in who were older men. None of them had participated in the Battle of Berlin because all the young men were dead. So all these old men came in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, rolling into Manchuria, and they said, Stalin thought he was on a roll. He said, I'm going to go down in through the Korean Peninsula and hit Japan. Now, the whole thing is, the Korean Peninsula and Japan are so close that if you drink a beer in Japan and throw it into the water, it's going to wash up on a Korean beach, and vice versa. That's how close they are. A bridge could have been built hundreds, thousands of years ago. The only thing that's ever prevented it is politics. So you've got the situation like Canada, bordering the United States. That's why I made that analogy. When Durham White Stevens was made dictator of Korea, that would be like the Japanese putting a prime minister of their own in charge of Canada, north of the United States. That's exactly what I meant. You've got a direct border between Korea and Japan. If Stalin had rolled all the way down in the Korean Peninsula, he could have invaded Japan from the south. But the Japanese stopped it, because their largest industrial complex was not on Japan itself. The largest industrial complex on Asia in the entire continent was Konan, K-O-N-A-N, known in Korean as Hungnam, H-U-N-G-N-A-M. And they dammed the Chosen River, 2 other river tributaries, and the Alu, another river. All 3 rivers were dammed, and they generated so much hydroelectric power that they could power almost the entire Japanese nation from all the power sourcing out of the single industrial complex of 3 dammed gorges in North Korea. But they were using it to produce atomic bombs. North Korea is saturated in uranium, weapons-grade uranium, so they produced atomic bombs, which they used to create the demilitarized zone. Now, in the middle of North and South Korea, you have the largest demilitarized zone in the world. How was that created? Nobody knows. Nobody talks. It was created by the Japanese. When the Soviets were rolling down the Korean Peninsula towards Japan itself, they took all these warheads and they blew them like atomic landmines. They disintegrated the Soviet advance. They created a demilitarized zone, a trench so large that it's a nature preserve. There are several species of Siberian tiger, Far East Asian tiger, the types of cranes that are important to many royal families in Asia, from the Qing dynasty to the Yamato. All of these animals exist in this massive, miles-wide demilitarized zone created by dozens of nuclear warheads blown in the middle of the Korean Peninsula that, like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were such short generation of radiation, just a short outburst of radiation, that they were safe within a period of months. And the animals moved back in just like they did at Chernobyl, which is now a huge game preserve for wolves, mice, cats, various other types of animals, because the humans are all gone. Now, this is so large as a land-made, artificially man-made object, this Korean demilitarized zone, that it's visible from the moon without aid. Through your astronaut's faceplate, that's the only thing you can see from the moon, aside from the Great Wall of China. Now, this is where I get all kinds of crazy Americans who come up and say, you can't see the Great Wall of China from space. I was flying in a plane over China, and I can't see no Great Wall. Yeah, there's this thing called atmospheric pollution, you dunderhead, because China is the most industrialized nation on Earth, you stupid moron, and they're generating all this particulate matter that flows all over the Pacific, all the way to your country, and that's why you can't breathe on an extremely warm day when you're in Nevada, because all that dust is coming from outer Mongolia. And all of this dust, because the Great Wall of China is Earth-colored, you can't see it from a plane that's a few thousand feet up, but you can see it from the moon because you see its shadow. That's the whole point, and they don't get this because they can't wrap their brains around this. But that is the reality. It's reported and verified by astronauts. If anyone comes up to you with that crap, you can't see it from the moon, they're full of it, and you can tell them Douglas Dietrich said so. It's the same way with the demilitarized zone in Korea. This is how large it is. It's visible from the moon. Now, all of this is historically monumental, and you've got the situation where Stalin, of course, once he fails in Korea, then he tries an amphibious invasion of Hokkaido, the northernmost main island of Japan. He steals Iturup and Tsushima, the Kurilsk island chain, and the large isle of Sakhalinsk, as the Russians now call it, and he rows down in there, and then he tries to get into Hokkaido itself, and that's where the Japanese naval tanks blow him out of the water. So if you go to Hokkaido in northern Japan, you can find all these remnants of these busted Soviet amphibious ships, these busted Soviet tanks, horses of skeletons of horses and men, because they were trying to transport cavalry on these amphibious boats into Japan itself. They all got blown away out of the water by Japanese naval tanks held in reserve, and Americans never speak of this. But this battle, the Americans saw, man, the Japanese are winning this without any banzai charges, without any kamikaze. The Japanese are kicking the Soviets' ass, and that's how Stalin lost the war in the East. He never gained northern Japan like he was supposed to. That's what Truman was begging him to get in on. So you've got Stalin losing up north, and Churchill wants in on this crap? Of course the British people said no. So when they went to the ballot on the 5th of July, back in 1945, they said, vote for Churchill, keep the war going. And, of course, all the servicemen who votes were allowed, as a matter of fact, to count all the veterans' votes overseas, shipped in for the final count, the vote wasn't reached until the 26th of July, even though it started on the 5th of July. When that came in, all the veterans, all of them in Britain had voted Churchill out of office. Everybody in the service, everybody said, F this. I don't want any more of this. The British people had been at war since 1939. None of them wanted it. So Churchill was voted out of office, and the war was still ongoing between Japan and America. So nobody remembers this. Everybody says, yeah, we were up there fighting the Japanese with our great friends, the Brits, at our side. Hey, where are you going? What do you mean we, white man? Yeah, and it all disappears. It all falls apart. You know, how about Stalin? Where are you, Papa Joe? Oh, I got my ass kicked. Oh, I have to stay up here. Oh, I got to pick up the pieces back in Berlin. And Truman's left here. Well, I dropped these bombs, and I'm left with these islands. What do? What do? You sue for peace, and you say you won. That's why when they signed this chicken-dip little peace ceremony on the battleship Missouri, you had this situation. Was it the Missouri or the Nevada? It almost doesn't matter because it was such a ridiculous propaganda ceremony. The one thing I can tell you is that the emperor was nowhere there. You had a bunch of guys come onto the ship, and none of them had any samurai swords to surrender. And MacArthur has got this ceremony of this so-called surrender, which lasts 18 minutes, and he's got this artificial American flag that's totally illegal. And this flag has only 31 stars on it. You can check the photograph. It's an illegal flag. The entire ceremony was illegal. And you take a look at the flag that's framed on the bulkhead of that battleship. And on that battleship, the Missouri and Nevada, I forget which at the moment, I believe it was the Missouri. At any rate, it was a joke. See all these sailors surrounding it. Everybody's filming it. And nobody asks, why is the American flag backwards and all the stars upside down? Now, it's not negative reversal, because if it were a negative reversal, all the people would be upside down. But all the stars are upside down, like satanic pentagrams. These are pentacles of Baphomet. And there's 31 of them, not the 48 states at the time. There's 31 of them because it's a transposition of the number 13, the original 13 colonies. So you've got a double inversion on the most satanic sense of the original 13 colonies taken to 31 of these satanic pentacles, and no American looks at that and says, what's going on? And why is this ceremony illegal? And why does it last only 18 minutes? And you've got MacArthur getting rid of everybody as soon as possible. There's no samurai swords exchange, and the whole thing's a joke. Well, nobody asks because nobody cares, because nobody wants to die anymore, and everybody's glad to come home, and everybody wants to hear Jap surrender, and the war is over. So all of that is pushed, and you see this big headline that's held up by Harry Truman with this big cheese-eating grin on his face, Jap surrender. Well, I can point out another headline to you where he's holding up a headline that says, Dewey beats Truman, too. He's got the same smile on that. And both of these are totally fictitious headlines that are absolutely incorrect. So
you are on a roll, Douglas, just on a roll.
Well, this is what, and Americans will say, well, why do we still have troops in Germany? That's the funniest one. They might as well be saying, we've got breeding populations in bases on the moon. I mean, it's that deranged, that insane. And no American seems to be aware of the fact, which they could easily look up, that on September 12th of 1990, actually in 1989, with the fall of the Berlin Wall was when this was set up, but on September 12th of 1990, the United States, the Soviet Union, France, and Great Britain concluded a peace treaty with the German Federal Republic, or the Bundesrepublik Deutschland, otherwise known as West Germany, and the German Democratic Republic, known as Ost or East Germany. Now, both of these governments, of course, did not exist at the time of World War II. These were not what declared war against the United States. Adolf Hitler with his Third Reich did that. So why were they getting together before the collapse of the Soviet Union to make peace with East and West Germany just so that they could claim World War II was formally over? Well, they did this because they needed United Germany, or New Vereinigte Deutschland, to float the Deutschmark as the basis on which to build the euro. So since everybody else was poor in Europe, because they all lost their ass, they all said, man, we need these Germans. They're so rich. Their quality of life is so high. We got to get them to float this euro. Let's make peace. So they all got together and made peace with East and West Germany, and that was September 12th of 1990. Now, what that did was it ended all occupation of Western and Eastern Germany. The Soviets pulled back, and they left a bunch of nuclear missiles. Now, granted, these were SRBMs and MRBMs, short and medium-range ballistic missiles, but that still enables Germany to hit with a nuke anywhere from Moscow to London with relative ease. So Germany is this nuclear power sitting in the center of Europe that the Soviets created as a bulwark against American imperialism expanding too far west, and they did this in full knowledge the Americans were going to be doing the shit they're doing now, which is causing crap in Ukraine, various other areas that Putin is trying to reinvade and stabilize in his own military fashion. Now, all of this is taking place on what would be Germany's Eastern Front. In the center sits Germany, wealthy enough to bail out Greece and everybody else, and with all the nukes. And they're sitting there. They haven't been occupied since 1990, when all of this was formally declared by the Soviet Union before it fell apart. So the Allies legally did this. But one needs to ask two questions. First, where was China? The Nationalist Chinese Republic was a member of that 5-seated Security Council of the United Nations when it was formed. Well, of course, no one talks about it. They joined the Axis. So now they're the enemy. And communist China was never at war with Nazi Germany, so they weren't there to participate in this farce. So the whole thing's a joke, but they got the euro floated, and of course, now Britain's part of this European Union, which Germany dominates. China, of course, is a member of the Axis, not recognized by the United Nations, nationalist China, that is. And of course, Japan is one of the world's greatest economic and regional superpowers with an enormous military. That the Americans keep saying is a Coast Guard. It's a Coast Guard, even though it's got aircraft carriers. You've got this situation where everybody says, but we won the war, and we've still got people in Japan and Germany. I mean, since 1990, it's 2015 now. That's like 2 decades almost that Americans haven't had anybody in Germany, but you still keep talking to Bubba and his uncle, and they still think people are there. It's that crazy. It's that insane. They might as well say we left astronauts on the moon, and they reproduce by fission like amoeba, and we've got the moon now, and it belongs to us. It's that stupid. So, but Americans believe that because that's how insane Americans truly are from information denial. It's like some kind of malnutrition that leads to a kind of retardation. They can no longer reason or think straight. And as a result, you've got this fantasy. So I hope that puts it in some perspective, and I'll count on you, of course, in the last few minutes to add some more questions to tie it all up, because I'm done.
Oh, yeah, right. You gave me like 5 minutes.
Sorry.
But that's okay. In all that you're saying, it sounded like Russia had nothing. There's nobody there. They don't have any money. They're barely holding themselves together. So why do we consider Russia being such a superpower? Why is there this overwhelming belief that they're a superpower, and there was the whole Cold War thing? Is that just to keep us in some fake fight so that the machine can continue?
Oh, absolutely. Thank you for asking that, because that brings us to the last part. If you go to Title 38 of the U.S. Code, and Title 38 of the U.S. Code is not like some Mickey Mouse bureaucratic regulation. This isn't a federal regulation. This is law. This is law as created by Congress. What Title 38 of the U.S. Code will say is that the Second World War went into ceasefire on December 31st of 1946. People can look this up. This is established by Congress. That means that every single veteran through the CFR, which is, of course, the Code of Federal Regulations. The Code of Federal Regulations is, again, federal law. This is equal to a executive order. So with the Code of Federal Regulations, veterans are allowed to be awarded for injuries suffered in combat, disablement injuries, be awarded disability. All of this lasts, their ability to say that they got injured in World War II, till December 31st of 1946. So what does that mean? It means that that chicken dip little ceremony on the battleship in Tokyo Bay wasn't recognized by your United States government. Your United States government does not recognize that surrender ceremony. That ceasefire wasn't even reached where Japan and the United States were still in a state of war until peace was declared, but they were in a state of war under ceasefire conditions, but still in a state of war until August 28th of 1952. Now, with Title 38 of the U.S. Code and the Code of Federal Regulations riding on this, it's an example of how America was and is still at war with the Third Reich. This is why all of America is still on the daylight savings time. Now, if you look back up the history of daylight saving time, it didn't exist until World War I, when Woodrow Wilson put it into effect for World War I. After World War I and the Spanish flu, the American Army flu, basically killed off an enormous part of the world's population. We were no longer at war, and he took us off of daylight savings. We weren't on daylight savings until Roosevelt again. Then Roosevelt put us back on wartime. So your daylight savings time is wartime. You are still in a state of war. You can take a look at your phone bill every month. There used to be women who used to take a phone line and jack it into a switchboard. These women, they didn't want to overwhelm them during wartime with mothers calling to see if their sons were all right, or fathers calling to see if their sons had arrived home alive at all. So by adding a phone tax, they prevented any calls they felt except emergency and wartime legitimate calls. Now, that bill for your wartime phone calls, that wartime phone tax, is still in effect. You can look at your phone bill every single month of the year, and you're going to see a federal tax that says a World War II phone tax, or it'll say federal tax is meant for the World War II phone tax. We are still at war. So everybody doesn't take these little things in their lives like daylight savings, like these federal phone bills on your, these federal taxes attached to your phone bill every month, but you're living in wartime because you're still legally at war with the Third Reich. That's what the war is about, but they couldn't tell you that, so they kept saying, well, we got the Soviet threat, the Soviet threat. That was all a joke. Their threat is the Third Reich in exile. This is why they could never declare war in Korea. They could never declare war in Vietnam. You can't declare another war while you're still at war. Okay. Sorry. Was I getting redundant? But you
No. I'm looking at the clock, and I have like 1 minute, if that.
Okay.
So, I love you, Douglas.
Yes, what's that?
I said I love you, Douglas.
I love you too.
But we need to wrap up, and I was just trying to think of a kind way of just getting your attention.
Yes, dear lady.
If people want to learn more about you, follow, your work or whatever, what's the best place for them to go, or anything?
Go to DouglasDietrich.com. Help us by ordering my videos, and you can get this on the DVD set that will help explain this in depth with records that you can continually reference again and again. Also, follow me on Facebook, Facebook.com/DouglasDwayne-Dietrich, and also follow my own radio show, which is on Saturdays and Tuesdays, not in conflict with our dear Dr. Rita at all, and that'll be at 10 to midnight Eastern Standard Time on Tuesdays and Saturdays on freedomslips.com. From Freedom's Lips to your ears, freedomslips.com, and that'll be Douglas Dietrich on critical emissions and Saturday night firing lines, found on the schedule at Studio A.
Okay.
There you go. Thank you.
I think we need to have like a thing where that takes, what you say into like a, 33, from 78 to 33. And then it'll be like, and that's on DouglasDietrich.com.
Yes. One thing I'd like to bring up is that during World War II...
the music's going to come up, so very quick.
95% of all your proven reserves of oil were used up, 7 billion barrels. That left America entirely dependent on the House of Saud. So just think about that. And all of that was based on a war that never needed to happen. Very, very important to remember. I love you dearly, Dr. Rita Louise, and I do hope you have me back on more often.
Okay, because there's still stuff we need to talk about.
Yes, much. Yes,
or you need to talk about. How's that?